everybody. We live in what I think the Chinese call interesting times, particularly in Central and North America. Everything seems to be changing. Google has even agreed that it will change the Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America because a certain Donald Trump wants to name change. Trump seems to be changing everything. He got involved with Denmark in what the New York Times called an icy exchange over Greenland, very icy. Greenland is, of course, icy, and Trump sees that as the future of American security. Tensions and defiance in Panama after Trump threatens to take it back. And America's two most, at least the US's two most immediate neighbors, Mexico and Canada, are in the eye of the storm when it comes to Trump over tariffs. There's even talk, according to the London Independent newspaper, that Trump wants Canada as the 51st state of America. I'm not sure Canadians would agree. One person who I'm not sure he speaks on behalf of Canada, but he's a very distinguished Canadian, is my guest today, Michael Ignatieff. He's a very well-known politician, writer, historian of liberalism. He has a wonderful new piece in Liberties, the quarterly of intelligence. It's called The Adults in the Room. It's about the crisis of liberalism and the changes in the world. Michael is joining us from Vienna. Michael, do you feel like an adult in the room amidst all this chaos?
Well, it's a great question. I sometimes feel I'm still a kid, but clearly we're living through the end of a long period. It may be, some people think this is the biggest change, historical change since 1989, for example. It may be even bigger than that in the sense that it's the biggest change since 1945, in the sense that it's a complete revision of America's role in the world. Trump used to be, the American president used to believe that alliances were a way to increase American power and influence. And Trump's view of Denmark, Canada, places that are very good allies for a long time, seems to treat allies as enemies and seems to ask the question only, what can I get out of any relationship with these allies? So every friend of America, and I think of myself as a friend of America because I'm a Canadian, and the best, luckiest thing that ever happened to Canada is that it's next door to the United States. But being treated like an enemy by somebody who used to treat you like a friend turns your world upside down. And so I don't know what it's like in this inside, you will judge better than I, but from the outside, it feels like a absolutely new world.
Your piece reflects on this and your lifelong relationship with the United States. You begin the essay by saying, well, other kids had baseball or hockey stars for heroes, and you're talking about your childhood in the 50s and 60s. Mine were Jack and Bobby Kennedy, Bayard Rustin, Martin Luther King Jr., and Rosa Parks. What was it like growing up in Canada with those kind of American heroes?
Well, it wasn't just those political heroes, because they taught us lessons in civil disobedience. They taught us lessons in leadership. They taught us lessons in courage. And frankly, many of our own leaders in Canada seemed a little gray in comparison, though now that I'm a little older and wiser, I see that we had some pretty good leadership in Canada in the 60s. Lester B. Pearson, who won a Nobel Prize for inventing peacekeeping, would be my charter example. But it wasn't just that American leadership was really admired by a kid like me. It was also the music. It's just, the music.
You write about it. You say
the music was so fantastic, and so there was a certain kind of enchantment about America that I think is now gone, and for all kinds of reasons.
Is it gone? You write, my parents' heroes were Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller, and Ella Fitzgerald. Mine were Buddy Holly, Bob Dylan, Marvin Gaye, Sam Cooke, Wilson Pickett, and the Four Tops. We did a show last month with Jonathan Taplin. I'm sure you're familiar with him. He was Bob Dylan's tour manager. He was the producer of Mean Streets. he still thinks that there is, and I'll come back to this word later because you bring it up at the end of the essay, vitality in American culture. Do you agree? U.S. culture, U.S. American culture.
Oh, I don't think there's any. I don't think there's any doubt. And Bob Dylan is still touring, and talk about vitality. I just don't know how he does it. And Springsteen is not out of gas, and there's some other great artists. And the thing about America that makes it so explosively creative is this encounter between black gospel music, black rhythm and blues, black jazz, and white country and Western music, regional music of all kinds. I mean, and then the unbelievable way in which some of those popular traditions got pushed right up into high culture. So it's still an incredibly creative culture.
It's interesting, Michael, that you bring up Dylan and Springsteen. Dylan's in his 80s, Springsteen in his 70s. Aren't there any younger ones you know about?
Oh God, I stopped listening to music, in 1974, and I'm one of those people who believes that all the best music was when I was a kid. So I couldn't give you modern stuff, except occasionally I tune in on a radio and I hear something that's fantastic, and so it's still coming. I'm just saying I'm rooted in that fantastic period from about 1959 to about 1975. And I just thought, American music was unbelievably great. And Canada, by the way, was a tremendous part of that. Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and the band, all those wonderful musicians that played with Dylan were part of the creation of this, I think, very unique moment.
You write in the essay about being what you call a pro-American liberal. How much was your liberalism, or is your liberalism, bound up in the culture, in the Dylan and Springsteen and all your other cultural American heroes?
I think there's no question. What was it to be a liberal? It was to vote for Adlai Stevenson against, Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s. That's something my parents would have done had they been able to vote in the United States. And I think the sense of being pro-American even survived through the Vietnam protests. I demonstrated against the war in Vietnam from 1965 right through to Nixon's second inaugural in 1972. And I marched with many Americans who'd fled north as so-called draft dodgers or draft resistors. But I was always on the side of those who wanted to call back America to, the better angels of its nature, as Lincoln called them, as opposed to those, and they were on the kind of socialist or more radical end, who regarded the Vietnam War as a kind of demonstration of what was rotten, terminally rotten about, America, that it had become an imperialist, violent, predatory country. I never believed that. I believed that it had blundered into a terrible error and it could get back to what it should be, which is a shining light. I may have been naive to believe that, but that is what I believed. And I think it structured my liberalism ever after, and is responsible for some illusions that I've had about America, which I can't seem to shed and don't want to shed.
Talk about America then as a shining light. You note in the essay that you two of your teachers were Judith Sklar and Isaiah Berlin. Of course, you've written award-winning biography of Berlin, probably the best biography out there. You note that some people were critical of Berlin and Sklar because they seemed to support the American Cold War and perhaps the American Cold War wars. Do you see, Michael, any connection between the Cold War wars, obviously in Korea and Vietnam, and the current wars that America is involved in, implicitly or otherwise, but particularly perhaps in Gaza? Is there a connection? Young people these days in 2025, or some young people at least, seem as outraged by what America is and isn't doing in Gaza as your generation was in what America was and wasn't doing in Vietnam?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's a very painful one. It comes into my classrooms. I teach here. I teach people from all over the world, and anger and rage about Gaza is pretty well in every classroom you look at, certainly in mine. I think the connection with liberalism is that if you think about what it was to be a liberal in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it included a very, very strong belief in the state of Israel, partly because of the Holocaust, partly because of the incredible achievements of the state of Israel, building this, raucous, crazy, incredibly creative democracy in the middle of a very tough neighborhood. And I've been, strongly in favor of Israel all my life, and I've lived there and taught there and have, tons of friends there and stuff. But I think even for me, Gaza has been a moment of truth. It's obvious that Israel was savagely, unjustly, murderously attacked in October 2023. It had to reply. The difficulty of dealing with Gaza was that all of the bad guys you were trying to get were hidden under hospitals, schools, and people. There's 500 miles of tunnels. It was a Geneva Convention's nightmare in terms of just complying with the basic rules of war. But the level of destruction, the amount of killing, the amount of devastation, and above all, the failure to have any kind of plan for what happens to Gaza afterwards. Right as you and I are talking, people are trying to stream home to what's left of homes. It's all rubble. And there's simply no authority that anybody can see that can guide them into the future. And that's a terrible failing for a democracy that I've admired all my life. I just think, the simplest way to say it is that Israel has laid up for itself another 3 or 4 generations of Palestinians who grew up hating a country with whom they actually, in the end, will have to make peace.
There's a certain darkness, maybe even a pessimism in the piece about the decline of liberalism, changes in the United States. We'll touch on Trump later. One thing that, and correct me please if I'm wrong, one thing that doesn't seem to come up is the decline in the power and legitimacy of international organizations, which of course Canada is one of the great champions of. You talk about demonstrating against American racism and Jim Crow and Vietnam. You don't talk much about the UN or international organizations. Have you never been much of a believer, Michael?
Oh, no, I'm not. I think it's in another part of the stuff I'm working on. My father, several of my uncles worked for UN organizations most of their lives. For example, I had a wonderful uncle, an old Russian uncle, who used to tramp through the fields of the developing world trying to persuade people not to leave night soil, which, excuse folks, that means not shitting in your own fields. So he worked for the FAO, a UN organization, all his life. So I've had tremendous admiration up close for what UN agencies have done. And my father sat on the Security Council during the Six-Day War in 1967. So yeah, I part of the story of liberalism you'd want to tell is, from 45 onwards, the enormous upsurge of hope in what we call the rules-based international order, human rights, the Security Council, UN agencies, the Geneva Conventions, the whole apparatus. It's the stuff I teach to this day, but there's simply no way to avoid concluding that it's all in ruins. It's in ruins. The Geneva Conventions have been mostly ignored in current conflicts, both in Ukraine and in Gaza. The Security Council is completely deadlocked. UN agencies are trying to help in Gaza, but they've been basically shut out by Israel, which is shocking to me. So wherever you look, the international order that liberalism invested so much confidence in is in serious, serious trouble. And I think that Trump will accentuate that tendency. He didn't cause it. He didn't start it. But we are in a new world. We're back to a world of great power politics that is unrestrained by anything that looks like international law. I'm very, very pessimistic, in other words, about that.
Did it really go away? Your essay also got adapted for the Washington Post, and there's these images of old pillars of antiquity, but it suggests with those pillars of antiquity that there was once a building. Was there once a real building when it came to international organizations, or was it just all hot air and promises?
No, I think there was a building. There was a building because great powers, particularly the Soviet Union, we forget this, the Soviet Union was not a spoiler. The Soviet Union was often vetoed things at the Security Council, but it believed in some kind of international order because as a less powerful state than the United States, it had an interest in these rules as kind of maintaining an equilibrium. We now have a Russia led by Putin, who's essentially an insurgent against that order. And the details are very shocking to me. I mean, for example, in the Baltic Sea at the moment, there isn't a day without some either Chinese or Russian vessel dragging a drag anchor through the cabling that connects, Finland to Denmark and so on. So, and that's a sign that you've got a great power that simply doesn't care about a whole set of rules that used to work, which is you leave people's cables alone, right? You let people, you don't interfere with navigation. And so we're in a world where it's very hard to trust anything. And Putin is the guy who sent missiles to the insurgents in eastern Ukraine, and they used it to shoot down an international airliner in open airspace, which means that an international order where you never had to think about the security of international airspace, that's gone. You didn't used to have to think about the security of international maritime travel. You do now. You can't get a ship through the Red Sea without worrying about the damn Houthis. And who are the Houthis being egged on by? By a member state of the United Nations, namely Iran. So we could go around the whole block here, but this is what it means when we say the rules-based international order is falling apart.
Yeah, and some people might say, well, why? America's no different in its support for Israel.
Oh, yeah. I'm not trying to duck America's responsibility. Its support of Israel and its inability to restrain Netanyahu, to force Netanyahu and the Israeli government to, come up with a plan to govern Gaza.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would agree with the word inability. It seems unwillingness. Let's briefly talk about Russia. You don't bring up Russia in this, but your family's from there. You're, again, a keen observer. You're based in Vienna, so you're much closer to Putin's Russia than I am in San Francisco. One thing that struck me about Putin, you noted before that the Soviet Union believed in some ways in the international order. Is Putin's Russia just a descent into absolute nihilism? I'm struck by the fact that they supported the Assad regime unambiguously, which was probably the most murderous regime in the world since Pol Pot. How do you make sense of this? Is there any morality at the heart, if that's the right word, of Putin's Russia, or has it just disappeared entirely?
Well, I think in relation to Syria, Russia's and the Soviets before them had a long-standing relationship with the Assad regime and the Assad dynasty. So, and I think they were prepared to put up with almost anything. The Soviets have supported a lot of really awful people, and the Americans have supported an awful lot of terrible people in the interests of their global interests. What I think is different is that when push came to shove, a Brezhnev or a Gorbachev or an Andropov understood that making certain agreements with the United States and making certain international agreements was in their interest. It was a way of essentially restraining American power and confirming their authority in the international system. And now it seems to me you have a Putin who's just decided the international system doesn't work for me at all. I'm a failing petrostate. Let me line up with China and North Korea and Iran, and let's smash this thing up and see whether we can push back sufficiently to recruit, for example, the BRICS countries and create an alliance against the hegemon. And I think some of Trump's extremely aggressive responses are conditioned by his awareness that the rules-based international order is gone. He's facing an alliance of autocracies, and you better get rough. And so this is the world we've gone into, and it is certainly not the world that I thought I would be spending the the autumnal years of my life watching emerge. I mean, it's a real shock, and it's very frightening. It's an extremely dangerous world. The single image that makes me sometimes actually frightened is to have seen, the cockpit video from a U.S. Surveillance plane in international airspace being buzzed within about 1.5 feet by a Russian plane. All they have to do is collide up there. All they have to do is have bad communications between two superpowers, and we could get into an escalation that's just, we don't know where that ends. And so part of the reason to have an international rules-based order is simply to create deconfliction protocols. This is boring stuff, but it's essential. If that were to happen, you've got to be absolutely sure that somebody can pick up the phone and get to Washington or get to the Kremlin and say, let's just calm this thing down. The ditto with Beijing, ditto with North Korea, ditto with the Iranians. And the sense that these deconfliction regimes are breaking apart is a source of real worry to everybody who thinks about how we stabilize this new world we've gone into.
So we're back to Gary Powers, we're back to Bay of Pigs, we're back to Cuban Missile Crisis. One figure who would have been all too familiar with this, who you write about in your essay, is Robert Francis Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy. You write in particular about his speech at after Martin Luther King's assassination, April 4th in Indianapolis. Of course, Bobby Kennedy himself would be assassinated a few months later. What it is about this speech, Michael, that somehow captures all the hope, the spirit of the 60s, the thing that you believed in, your liberalism?
Well, this is a speech in which Martin Luther King has just been killed that day. And Bobby Kennedy has a speech in Indianapolis, and he's actually standing on the back of a truck, as far as I remember, sort of in the dark, and he breaks the news to this crowd of mostly Black Americans that their leader has been brutally murdered by white extremists. And he talks, and he didn't do it very often, he talked about losing his brother and losing his brother to an assassin. And just tried to share with them and express as a leader that he understood their grief, he understood their horror, he understood their revulsion. He begged them to not lash out, begged them not to riot, begged them to sustain their faith in democracy. It's one of the great speeches in the American tradition, and the American tradition has some great speeches going back to Lincoln's second inaugural and the Gettysburg Address, and this speech belongs with it, as Martin Luther King's speech. And if you're a non-American liberal like me, these speeches are scripture. We love this stuff about the United States. I'm not I lived 15 years in the United States and did my graduate work there. And I don't think I'm naive about America's failings and weaknesses, and above all, its violence. But these speeches are absolutely central to what I think political leadership ought to be. They're central to what I think a liberal ought to be. And there's something deeply touching to me about him standing on the back of the truck talking to desperate, frightened, tearful Black men and women.
Yeah, they didn't. He was.
This
Yeah.
is just. This is it to me. This is the great stuff.
Yeah, and I think for most of that audience in Indianapolis, Bobby Kennedy was actually telling them that Martin Luther King had died. They didn't know it, and Indianapolis was, whilst there was riots in many cities in America that night, there weren't in Indianapolis.
Yeah.
Bobby Kennedy, Michael, and again, you don't need me to tell you this, was a figure in the 60s who brought together working class whites and blacks, intellectuals like yourself, policymakers. What has happened to the power of a liberal figure like Bobby Kennedy? We really haven't seen anything since. Could we argue, you're from a kind of aristocracy yourself, that one of the problems with liberalism is it looks critically at privileged families like the Kennedys. So it makes it hard for the scion of families like the Kennedys to actually make their mark in politics these days.
Yes, this is a complicated subject. I mean, some of the greatest liberal heroes of the 20th century were aristocrats, Franklin Delano Roosevelt being the best example. A man very high-born who has this unbelievable gift to speak to Americans and make them feel that he understands them. And Bobby Kennedy had a bit of that, and his brother had a bit of that. So these patricians had a kind of form of connection. I think what's then happened from the 1960s onwards is that that patrician class basically declined, and what replaced it was a credentialed class and people who had, fancy degrees. And I'm a creature of that. I got fancy degrees, and I saw the ways in which Ivy League schools and other great American institutions basically credentialed a new elite, but in credentialing them, took them away from common American experience, so that they lived in a kind of just a different world and began to speak differently, began to think differently, began to act differently. And the inequalities that began to emerge in the 1970s with, wages declining for working people, but wages rising steeply for the professional credential classes, opened up a chasm, which I think broke the old liberal alliance between, kind of patrician whites and working class unionized whites and Black men and women. It broke all that apart. And then I think identity politics had another effect. I think race then played in big time. That is, once white liberalism secured the help, working with a great Black leadership, secured the Voting Rights Act. The Democratic coalition lost the South. That white Southern community began to go ever further to the right, I think out of fear for what the new opportunities that were opening up to Black people. So race played a part, class played a part, but it basically split apart the constituency that had sustained the great achievements of the liberal era. And let's remember what those achievements were. In my country, it was, we got a public health system, we got pensions. In the United States, you got Civil Rights Act, you got Medicare, you got the basic, you got Head Start, you got some of the basic stuff that put granite under people's feet. And the other thing that happened that I think liberals are very and rightly proud of was a kind of revolution of inclusion, feminism, gay rights, Black civil rights, the emancipation of whole categories of people who'd either had to been pushed down or forced to keep silent, were now essentially emancipated and began to participate big time in American politics. That was an amazing achievement, but it produced a huge backlash. And we're living some of the consequences of the backlash. But I don't think liberals should walk around crouched over apologizing. I mean, the revolution of inclusion was one of the best things that has ever happened to the United States, and certainly one of the best things that ever happened to Canada.
Are you suggesting then that the political class, if that's the right word, of FDR or JFK or RFK, even MLK, it's gone soft? They spend their time apologizing for their own privilege?
I think there's some apologizing about privilege that's kind of overdue. It's not so much the apologies that bother me; it's the sheer social gulf between an educated elite and ordinary working Americans. And there's that, and then there's also, I think, the collapse of union organization. I remember it as coming, being 18, 19, being aware that there were the United Auto Workers, there was the AFL-CIO, the steady weakening of American unions, I think also deprived, working Americans of a voice and the political power to get that voice heard.
Michael, this issue of liberties comes with some other interesting essays, one by Tim Wu, for example, on decentralizing capitalism. You're in Vienna. You're still associated with Central European University, of course, an institution supported by George Soros and that world. Is there a recognition in, so to speak, Soros world that progressives, the left, liberals, whatever you wanted to call it, need to reinvent themselves? Is there a sense of crisis, or do people think simply, well, everyone will eventually come to their senses on Putin and Trump and Modi and come back to liberalism?
Well, I love the idea, Andrew, that I'm supposed to be the spokesman for the Soros world conspiracy.
Well, yeah, I've made you the spokesman. I apologize if you're not.
I hasten to assure your viewers and listeners I am no such thing. I'm proud of my association with George Soros and proud of the work I've done with this university, but I don't know what the hell he's thinking about this, and I don't know what the hell his son is thinking about this. What I think is that, the tide has turned against liberalism. We should be extremely proud of our achievements, but we got a fight on our hands. I don't think there's anything to despair of. That is, I think politics is combat. Politics is a battle. It's a battle of ideas, and it's a battle of bodies on the line. I've done some of that, and I'm absolutely convinced that for example, Mr. Trump will run his course. He'll have his shot. He'll change America as best he can, and then there'll be a pushback, a strong pushback, and this battle will go on. I don't think, liberalism is not some kind of little cult. Liberalism is a deeply rooted set of instincts about how we keep a society together. And
the way you end the piece with a wonderful phrase, you describe liberalism's incorrigible vitality. That's very much a Michael Ignatieff observation. What's so incorrigibly vital about liberalism, Michael?
Well, I think liberalism is not just a set of political program points. What it is a way of life. It's a way of being. It's a way of, the way you and I are talking is a non-aggressive. I'm trying to listen to you. You're trying to listen to me. That sense of civility, that sense of listening, that sense that somebody else may have a better idea, that sense that political life is about finding ways to narrow disagreements so we can live together. It's about understanding and respecting disagreement. The fact that we disagree fundamentally about things is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. That instinct that a liberal has that we're all individuals. I am, the fact that I'm white is one thing about me, but it's not necessarily the most important thing. If I'm in the room with a black person, their blackness is not necessarily the most important thing about them. We can find ways to talk together about what we have to do together. That's I think the instinct that liberalism has, and above all, this sense of generosity, this sense of reaching out to others, the sense that we're tied in a common fate and a common experience, and we will, as Abraham Lincoln said, we will surely hang separately if we don't hang together. Those instincts about unity, about listening, about civility, these are not just a political program. They're the way we live our lives. And because they're the way we live our lives and they're what we try to teach our children, this stuff can survive an awful lot of political defeat. I've gone down to defeat a couple of times in my political life.
Yeah, you say in the piece, defeat is a great teacher. Your political defeats, less intellectual than political.
Sure. No, I've had defeats, but I'm extremely proud that I put my name on a ballot a couple of times in my home country, Canada. And I just think we've got to understand that liberalism wasn't some kind of little cute fad from the 50s and 60s that's now kind of out of date, like, bell-bottom trousers. This is a way of life. It's a civilizational commitment, and we need to stick with it.
Finally, what about Canada's role in this? In an FD piece you wrote recently, you talked about Freud's theory of the narcissism of minor differences, defining the tension between the US and Canada. There are lots of pieces, of course, about how the US want to take over Canada. Can Canada bring its intellectual heft, its history to rebuilding not just liberalism, but international organizations? Whenever anyone talks about the models for the future, progressive, tolerant, Canada usually comes up with Denmark and Australia. What can Canada and Canadians like yourself do in our current world, which is in crisis, at least from a liberal point of view?
Well, I think the interesting thing about Canada is, we look exactly like the Americans. We sound like them. We, love the same ball teams. We listen to the same music, blah, blah, blah. But our politics makes us very, very stubbornly different. And I think in a world that is globalizing, the stubborn difference between America and Canada is kind of a good thing. And so Canada needs to defend its national independence against this latest set of threats and menaces from Trump. And then we need to work with a lot of our friends, both in the United States and out in the wider world, to put together, I think, a new vision of what I think we all need desperately, which is a rules-based international order, by which we mean something very minimal. About 20 minutes ago, I was talking to you about deconfliction. We need to get these big guys deconflicted. We need to get them talking to each other. We could blow the whole goddamn world up if we don't get this right. And middle powers like Canada, like Denmark, like all these other middle powers, have for 80 years been in the room trying to get the big powers from using their weapons to destroy the planet. And we've got to get back into that business, because it was constitutive of what Canadian foreign policy was all about after the Second World War. It's what the foreign policy of all middle powers do, not because we're so damn virtuous, but because we're scared. Because if Trump doesn't get some deconfliction regimes going with Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, the world could go in a very, very bad place, which we don't want for our kids. It's just that simple.
Yeah, well, you are the adult in the room. Middle powers as the adults in the room, Michael Ignatieff. Maybe it's the great powers who now become the children, the Trumps, the Chinas, the Russias, the Irans. Michael Ignatieff, as always, a great pleasure and honor. And we will look forward to talking more about a world which remains increasingly interesting. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Lovely to talk to you.
Can I step on the scene? I'm ready to attack. Andrew Keane. Yeah, he's the one to bash. Asking questions, no filter, just keeps on grinning. He is the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. Money, fame, success, it's all in his sight. He'll dig deep, expose you with all his might. No sugarcoating, he'll cut right through. Andrew King, he's the one to spew. Yeah, he's an expert.